Organizations, whether they are small startups, family-run businesses, or large multinational corporations, naturally go through certain stages of growth. Leaders often find it surprising when past strategies stop working, teams face pressure, and processes start to fail, making the organization feel like it has outgrown its original way of operating. Larry Greiner's growth model helps explain this by showing that growth brings complexity, which then leads to crises that require new leadership approaches. Originally published in 1972, the model identifies 5 core phases of growth, each ending in a crisis that forces a change in management style. Essentially, as organizations grow, they must evolve their leadership and structure to handle new challenges. This presentation will walk through each phase and the related crisis, sharing practical insights, examples, and the pros and cons of using this model to better understand organizational development. The first phase is all about creativity, driven by founders focused on innovation and product development, which eventually leads to a leadership crisis that demands a shift in how the business is managed. In the early stages of an organization, communication tends to be informal, roles are flexible, and there's a lot of entrepreneurial energy driving rapid experimentation with little hierarchy or structure. However, as the organization grows, this informal approach starts to create chaos. Employees begin to need clearer direction and better coordination, and founders often realize they don't have enough management experience to handle the growing complexity. A good example of this is early Apple, where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak's creativity built the company, but as they expanded, they brought in experienced managers like Mike Markula and John Sculley to provide professional leadership. When organizations grow through more structured direction, professional managers introduce formal processes, clear roles, budgets, and expectations, along with more planning and reporting. But this shift often leads to a crisis of autonomy because middle managers can feel restricted by centralized decisions, creating bottlenecks and slowing innovation since everything requires approval. McDonald's experienced this in the 1970s and 1980s. The company expanded quickly under strong central control, but franchise managers pushed for more autonomy to adapt operations locally. This balance between control and freedom is a common challenge as organizations develop. As organizations grow, decision-making often becomes decentralized, giving business units or regional teams more autonomy. This shift allows senior leaders to concentrate on strategy rather than day-to-day operations, speeding up processes through delegation. However, this can also cause units to drift away from the overall corporate strategy, create inconsistencies across the organization, and make it hard for leaders to keep everyone aligned. A good example is 3M, which was well known for its decentralization and innovation but eventually encountered problems with product duplication and a lack of strategic cohesion, which required stronger corporate oversight. As growth continues, companies often introduce systems, key performance indicators, and cross-functional coordination to improve efficiency, sometimes adopting matrix structures. While these steps can standardize operations, they can also lead to new problems like bureaucracy, slower decision-making, excessive reporting, and numerous meetings, which can frustrate both managers and employees. This phase highlights the balance organizations need to strike between control and coordination to maintain agility without creating unnecessary red tape. Under Jack Welch's leadership, General Electric managed to cut down on the layers of bureaucracy that had built up from earlier phases focused on coordination. When organizations grow through collaboration, they tend to emphasize teamwork, shared values, and culture, supporting flexible structures where teams are empowered and communication is open. This approach encourages innovation and organizational learning. However, collaboration alone eventually reaches its limits. It can't sustain growth indefinitely. At that point, companies often need to explore new markets, make acquisitions, or form partnerships because internal resources start to fall short. Google is a good example. Its collaborative culture fueled incredible innovation, but as the company grew, it needed major structural changes and acquisitions like YouTube and Android to keep growing. Building on this, Greiner later highlighted growth through alliances, where organizations expand via mergers, joint ventures, ecosystems, and partnerships. This makes them part of broader networks, sharing both risks and innovation. But as these alliances increase, companies can face identity crises, struggling to maintain a clear, unified identity while dealing with cultural clashes and integration issues. Starbucks expanded globally by partnering with local businesses, but this approach sometimes led to challenges in maintaining a consistent brand identity across different markets. Greiner's growth model is practical because it helps leaders anticipate future challenges, like a leadership crisis in a startup or the need for decentralization as companies grow. It also helps diagnose current issues, such as bureaucracy or slow decision-making, linking these problems to specific growth phases. The model guides leaders in choosing the right organizational structure at each stage, from flexible and creative setups early on to more defined roles and collaboration later. Additionally, it supports change management by offering a clear story so employees understand why changes are necessary and what to expect next. The first step in applying this model is to identify what growth phase your organization is currently in. To understand how to navigate organizational growth effectively, start by examining how decisions are made, how formal the processes are, what employees are complaining about, and where bottlenecks occur. This helps identify the emerging crisis, which might involve leadership overload, middle management frustration, increasing bureaucracy, misalignment, or cultural fatigue. Once you spot these issues, the next step is to redesign structures and processes. For example, shifting from creativity to direction might mean introducing functional managers, moving from direction to delegation involves decentralizing decision-making, and transitioning from delegation to coordination requires implementing cross-functional systems. It's important to prepare for the next crisis because each solution may create new problems, so leaders should plan ahead rather than just react. Finally, communicate the transition clearly by explaining why the change is necessary, what improvements it will bring, and how roles will evolve. This helps reduce resistance and creates alignment across the organization. The model offers a clear and intuitive framework, making it straightforward to understand and apply across different industries. It helps leaders move from reacting to problems as they arise to anticipating challenges before they become critical, which is a big shift in management approach. It also makes clear the connection between organizational structure and growth, showing leaders how their design needs to change as the company evolves. This is especially useful for strategic planning and leadership development because it provides guidance on key decisions like hiring, delegation, and restructuring. However, there are some limitations to keep in mind. The model can oversimplify reality, as organizations don't always follow a neat, linear path. It assumes continuous growth, but in practice, businesses can experience decline, stagnation, or cycles of ups and downs. Cultural differences are also underemphasized since the model was developed mainly in a Western corporate context. Additionally, crises within organizations often overlap rather than happening one at a time. Finally, the model doesn't fully account for external factors such as market shocks, technological changes, or competition, all of which can disrupt the usual sequence of growth phases. GREINERS' growth model continues to be a valuable tool for understanding how organizations evolve. It shows us that as a company grows, it becomes more complex, and that complexity eventually leads to a crisis. This pattern helps leaders anticipate what changes are needed in their structure and culture at each stage. By identifying where they currently stand, spotting the coming challenges, and redesigning their organization accordingly, leaders can manage growth more effectively and prevent common obstacles that slow progress. Although the model isn't perfect and should be adapted rather than followed rigidly, it provides a clear guide for growing businesses, enhancing leadership skills, and creating organizations that can change and succeed over time. In today's environment, where growth brings both chances and challenges, this model gives leaders the insight and foresight necessary to lead their teams through every phase of development.